Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, I want to talk about something that's been on my mind for a while when it comes to K-pop boy groups. You might have felt it too, but something just feels a bit off, right? Like, why do K-pop boy groups feel stuck in the past? Why do they feel old? I'm not just talking about nostalgia or missing a certain era, but more like an overall stagnation that's really hard to ignore. So, let's get into it. Let's start with the core issue. Why boy groups feel stagnant. It feels like they've been recycling the same sounds, the same visual aesthetics, and even the same concepts over and over again. Don't get me wrong, their performances are always on a massive scale. High budget stages, big choreographies, crazy pyrotechnics, but there's a lack of that freshness you get from girl groups or even indie male artists. I think one of the main reasons this happens is because boy groups tend to stick to established K-pop tropes. You know, the kind I'm talking about. The dark, edgy concepts. The angsty, rebellious themes. The over-the-top EDM breakdowns. At first, it's exciting and powerful, but after a while, it just feels like we've seen it all before. Take, for example, the rise of the fourth-generation boy groups. Many of them are still relying heavily on sounds and styles that were popular back in the mid-2010s. Sure, they've polished it and made it more intense, but it's not new. It's not innovative. And here's the thing, even though their performances are huge, the lack of progression in their musical direction and visual evolution is glaring. K-pop thrives on change, right? Yet boy groups seem to be stuck in this weird loop where they're not really exploring new artistic directions. It feels like a lot of them are just sticking to what worked in the past, and because of that, it feels stagnant. The real heart of the issue is the lack of innovation and visual evolution. Boy groups are usually introduced with a bang, with big debuts, extravagant concepts, but after that, many of them fail to evolve in any significant way. What you see in their debut era tends to follow them throughout their career. One reason for this could be the pressure from fans. A lot of boy group fans are very attached to a group's concept, and while that loyalty is great, it can also mean that fans resist change. So, what do the companies do? They stick to the same formula because they know the fans will stay loyal as long as they don't mess with the group's sound or look too much. And let's be real, companies play it safe. They're not willing to risk alienating their core fan base by experimenting too much, so they keep pushing out similar songs, concepts, and visuals. It becomes a cycle of predictability. And that's a major reason why a lot of these boy groups feel old. They're not pushing any boundaries. They're staying comfortable. Compare this to girl groups, who have been much more willing or maybe forced to diversify. We've seen girl groups experiment with different concepts, sounds, and aesthetics in a way that boy groups just haven't. And that's a big reason why girl groups often feel fresher. They're constantly changing things up. Another factor here is that it's much harder for boy groups to find a niche. When you think about it, there are only a handful of concepts that boy groups lean into. You've got the dark, aggressive bad boy image, the sweet boyfriend vibe, the high energy, EDM route, and maybe a couple more. It's not like girl groups, where there's a lot more flexibility in terms of concept. You've got girl crush, you've got cutesy, you've got elegant and classy, or even hyper-feminine, trend-driven aesthetics. There's more room to play around. But for boy groups, it feels like they're boxed into these few tropes, and they don't get the same room to experiment. This limited scope makes it harder for boy groups to find a niche that hasn't already been done. So instead of evolving, they just lean further into whatever concept they debuted with, but it doesn't lead to anything new or exciting. And the end result is that we, as listeners, get bored. Now, let's talk about how this impacts their marketability, both within K-pop and internationally. In the K-pop world, boy groups tend to have loyal fan bases that will support them regardless. But when we're looking at expanding into the international market, that lack of innovation starts to hurt them. Global audiences are constantly looking for what's new, what's fresh, what's going to stand out. And when boy groups keep doing the same thing, it's hard for them to break through in the way they need to. Sure, they might have huge fan bases, but outside of those loyal fans, there's little appeal. They need to find ways to capture the casual listener, the person who isn't already deeply invested in K-pop. and the current approach doesn't do that. Girl groups have an easier time here because they're leaning into trends that are more accessible. Their performances and music are simpler, more memorable, and often trendier. Boy groups, on the other hand, are focused on grandiosity, and while that's cool to watch, it doesn't necessarily create a lasting impression for non-fans. There's a disconnect between the scale of their performances and the ability to leave a memorable mark. Here's something interesting though: the rise of indie male artists. These smaller, independent artists have been making waves lately, both inside and outside Korea. Why? Because they're doing the opposite of what boy groups are doing. They're being more authentic, more raw, more willing to experiment with sound and style. They're not held back by these big company formulas, so they're free to make whatever music they want, and that's appealing. People are gravitating toward this authenticity because it feels fresh and different from what's happening with boy groups. It's surprising that no boy group has leaned into this indie aesthetic yet. You'd think at least one group would take that route and carve out a unique niche by focusing more on authentic storytelling, a raw, more natural aesthetic, or even just more minimalist performances. There's so much room for growth there, but for some reason, it hasn't happened yet. And it's a real missed opportunity. Now, to be fair, there are some boy groups that are starting to stand out, like ATEEZ and ENHYPEN. These two groups, I think, have done a great job of telling a story and building an identity that's more than just their music. ATEEZ, for example, has this whole pirate or adventure storyline that's helped them create a very distinct brand. They've been evolving, and it feels like there's thought put into how they grow musically and visually. ENHYPEN too has shown a lot of flexibility in their looks, sounds, and genres. They're willing to experiment, which is something more boy groups need to do if they want to stand out in the global market. If their company, Illit, takes the time to plan well thought out comebacks and concepts, ENHYPEN could really blow up internationally. They've got the versatility and talent to pull off almost anything, but it all comes down to strategic planning. And sadly, we don't always see that from boy group agencies. Boy groups have missed out on really pushing their visual identity forward. Sure, they might do a couple of high fashion gigs or show up at a runway event, but after that, nothing. They don't capitalize on those moments or use them to create a long-lasting visual narrative that could help them break out of that same old feeling. Look at groups like Stray Kids. While they've been massive in terms of fan base, it's only recently that they started exploring new genres in their albums. For a while, it felt like they were just feeding their fans the same sound, which is fine for die-hard fans, but won't help them reach new audiences. This brings me to Yeonjun's solo debut, Ggum. Let's be real, while his performance was technically great, it felt old. Like, it could have been from 2018, and no one would have noticed. Fans appreciated his skill, but a lot of the feedback was that it didn't bring anything new to the table. It's a perfect example of the larger problem boy groups are facing. Everything's polished and perfect, but it's not pushing any boundaries. Yeonjun's debut was a chance to step outside the group's comfort zone and try something fresh, but it ended up feeling like more of the same. And this is what's holding boy groups back. They have the talent, the looks, the budget, but they're not using that to create anything new. They're too comfortable, and it's starting to show. So, to wrap this up, I think it's clear that K-pop boy groups are at a bit of a crossroads. They have all the tools they need to evolve, but they're not using them. They're sticking to the same formulas, the same concepts, and it's making them feel old. If they want to stay relevant, especially in the global market, they need to start experimenting more, whether that's with sound, visuals, or storytelling. And honestly, I think a lot of the responsibility falls on the agencies to give these groups the freedom to explore and grow. Fans might be resistant at first, but if we want boy groups to feel new and exciting again, we've got to embrace change. So, what do you guys think? Do you feel like boy groups are stuck? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this deep dive. See you next time.